My own parents refused to help. Now CPS took my kids away. I never expected my body to betray me like that, not at the worst possible time. One moment, I was cleaning up after dinner, stacking dishes in the sink while my twins, Rowan and Eliana, played on the living room floor. The next, a pain so sharp and sudden ripped through my abdomen that I nearly collapsed. I had barely managed to grab my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, measured, but I could barely process what they were saying beyond the confirmation that help was on the way. My first thought, even through the haze of agony, was my children. They were only 4, too young to be left alone, too innocent to understand what was happening. I called my parents next, desperate. I hated asking them for anything. Over the years, they'd made it clear that my choices, having children young, without a husband, without a stable career, were my own burdens to bear. But I had no one else. I had no choice. The phone rang once, twice, and then my mother's clipped voice answered. I could barely get the words out between ragged breaths. Emergency. Hospital. Please, can you watch them? But there was a long silence on the other end. Then a sigh so sharp it cut through me deeper than my pain. We can't, Vivian. You know that. And just like that, I was alone in this. The paramedics arrived in minutes, but it felt like an eternity. One of them, a kind-eyed man named Jared, knelt beside me as I lay curled on the floor, whispering reassurances while his partner spoke into a radio. My vision blurred, the world tilting. Through the fog, I saw Rowan's tiny face, his hands gripping his sister's as they stood frozen. Their big, frightened eyes locked onto me. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice so soft I barely heard it. I wanted to answer. I wanted to hold them, to tell them it would be okay. But I couldn't. The pain was too much, the world was slipping away. As Jared lifted me onto the stretcher, my mind screamed for a solution. My parents had abandoned me. Who else could I call? Who else would care? By the time I was in the ambulance, I could barely keep my eyes open. My last conscious thought was the terror of knowing my babies were alone, abandoned by the only people who should have stepped up for them. When I woke up, the fluorescent lights above me buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow over the room. The pain was dulled, but ever-present, a deep ache in my gut. My throat was dry, my limbs heavy. Machines beeped softly in the background. I forced my eyes to focus, trying to piece together where I was. "You're in St. Mary's," a voice informed me, and I turned my head slightly to see a nurse adjusting my four. "You had a ruptured appendix. Emergency surgery. You're lucky you called when you did." Lucky. The word felt like a joke. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked. "My kids? Where are my kids?" She hesitated, a flicker of something. Pity? Concern? Crossing her face. "They're not here." Panic surged through me, stronger than any physical pain. "They were at home." I called my parents, but they said no. My breath came too fast, my chest tight, my heart racing. "Who's with them? Who?" The nurse reached for my shoulder, gently pressing me back against the bed. "Calm down, sweetheart. They're safe." The neighbors, Tessa and Mark Holloway, found them alone and called CPS. CPS. The letters hit me like a freight train. My body went rigid, my fingers clenching into fists against the sheets. This couldn't be happening. My mind spun, desperately trying to piece together how much time had passed, how long my children had been without me. "I need to see them," I croaked. "I'll get the doctor," the nurse said softly, but her eyes told me the truth. This wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't going to be something I could fix with a simple call or an explanation. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, before a doctor entered the room, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Dawson, you need to focus on recovery," he said. "You were in surgery for over 3 hours, and you lost a significant amount of blood." I barely heard him. "Where are my kids? When can I see them?" He sighed. Because they were found alone, Child Protective Services was contacted. Given the situation, they were placed in temporary care. Temporary care? My voice broke. "You mean foster care?" His silence was confirmation enough. A cold, creeping horror settled into my bones. My parents could have prevented this. They could have spared my children this trauma, but they chose not to. I could see it so clearly. My mother's dismissive tone, my father's indifference. They had always been distant, always disapproving. But I had never thought they would go this far. I had never believed they would let their own grandchildren be taken by strangers rather than lift a finger to help me. My babies were gone, and I had no idea how to get them back. I woke up to the cold, metallic scent of the hospital room clinging to my skin, the sterile white walls pressing in on me like a cage. The weight of everything hit me all at once, heavier than the 4 in my arm, heavier than the stitches pulling at my side. Rowan and Eliana were gone, taken, placed in some stranger's home because my own parents had turned their backs on me. My body was still weak, but the rage inside me burned hotter than any fever. The doctor had said I needed to rest, but how could I? How could I lay here, breathing in the stifling air of this hospital, knowing that my babies were out there somewhere, scared and alone? My mind raced with questions, each one more suffocating than the last. Where had they taken them? Were they together? Had they cried themselves to sleep, calling for me? Did the people who had them understand that Rowan needed his stuffed fox to fall asleep, that Eliana refused to eat anything green? My children weren't just names on a file. They were everything, and they were gone. I struggled to sit up, my body protesting with every movement. Pain lanced through me, sharp and unrelenting, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself upright. I had to get out of here. I had to find them. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone on the bedside table. My first instinct was to call my parents, to scream at them, to demand an explanation. But what good would it do? I already knew what their response would be. Cold, detached, dismissive. You made your bed, Vivian. Now lie in it. They had made it clear years ago that my life was a disappointment to them, that I was nothing more than a string of bad choices and wasted potential. But to punish my children for my mistakes, to let them be taken away rather than step in for one night, that was cruelty I hadn't been prepared for. Tears burned at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had no time for grief. I had to fight. I pressed the call button, waiting impatiently for a nurse to appear. When she finally did, her expression was careful, like she knew what was coming. She tried to tell me I needed to rest, that I wasn't ready to be discharged yet, but I barely heard her. I was already swinging my legs over the side of the bed, swallowing back the wave of nausea that rolled over me. My body was weak, but my will was stronger. By the time they finally released me, hours had passed. Hours that felt like lifetimes. I stepped out into the biting cold of the late autumn evening, the wind slicing through my thin hospital gown. My car was still at home, my phone nearly dead, my limbs trembling from exhaustion, but none of it mattered. I needed answers. I needed my children. The taxi ride to my apartment felt surreal, the city lights blurring into streaks through my unfocused gaze. My stomach twisted with dread as I reached my door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The silence inside was suffocating. Toys were still scattered on the floor where they had been playing. Rowan's little sneakers were by the door, one tipped over on its side. Eliana's pink blanket was draped over the couch, forgotten in the chaos. The sight of their things, untouched and waiting for them to return, was a punch to the gut. I sank to the floor, pressing a hand to my mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to break free. This wasn't just my pain to bear. It was theirs too. They had already lost so much. Their father had walked out before they were even born, vanishing without so much as a backward glance. I had promised them I would always be there, that no matter what, they would never be alone. And now, because of my own helplessness, because of my parents' indifference, I had failed them. I forced myself to my feet, my resolve hardening. If my parents thought they could cast me aside, if CPS thought they could take my children away and hand them to strangers, they were wrong. I would fight. I would claw my way through whatever bureaucratic nightmare they threw at me. No one was going to keep me from my babies. My first call was to CPS, my voice trembling as I demanded to know where my children were. The woman on the other end spoke in a tone so practiced, so devoid of real human empathy, that it sent a fresh wave of fury through me. "They're safe," she assured me, but that wasn't enough. Safe wasn't in my arms. Safe wasn't home. Safe wasn't hearing their giggles echo through the walls of our tiny apartment. She told me there would be an investigation, process, home visits, evaluations, interviews. They would decide if I was fit to be their mother. The words made my vision blur with rage. I had nearly died. I had no one to turn to, and now they were treating me like the villain in my own story, like I was the one who had failed my children when the truth was so much more complicated. As the call ended, I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. If this was a battle they wanted, then a battle they would get. I would prove to them, to everyone, that no one, not my parents, not CPS, not a world that had constantly tried to break me, was going to take my children away from me. I wouldn't let them. I spent the next week trapped in a purgatory of waiting, every second stretching out like a blade against my skin. CPS had assigned a caseworker, a woman named Valerie Dawson, no relation to me, but something about her name stung like irony. She visited my apartment, her eyes scanning the space with the cold detachment of someone who had already decided my fate. She took notes. She asked questions. She said words like concern and review process and best interest of the children. Each syllable felt like a noose tightening around my throat. I was drowning in paperwork, proof of income, proof of residence, statements from my doctor, a psychological evaluation. Every piece of my life dissected and scrutinized as if I were some sort of criminal, as if I had chosen to be hospitalized, as if I had left my children alone by choice. My body still ached. My stitches pulled with every movement, but I pushed through it. I wouldn't give them any reason to doubt me. I forced myself to eat, to sleep, to function, but every breath felt hollow without Rowan and Eliana. The silence of the apartment was unbearable. Their absence was a ghost that haunted me at every turn. Then came the home visit, the final step. Valerie arrived promptly, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning my apartment for signs of unfitness. I had scrubbed every inch of the space until my fingers were raw, reorganized every drawer, folded every blanket. I had prepared meals in advance, stocked the fridge, even bought new toys in case my children would be allowed to return that day. But none of it seemed to matter. She barely glanced at the apartment, her focus entirely on her notes, on the protocol she had already determined would decide my fate. Then she said it, the words that shattered me. The children are adjusting well to their foster placement. They seem comfortable, happy, stable. I felt the ground beneath me tilt. My vision swam. Comfortable, happy, stable. Words that didn't belong to strangers. Words that belonged to me. I had spent every second of the past 4 years pouring love into them, holding them when they cried, singing them to sleep, kissing their scraped knees. How dare she tell me they were better off somewhere else? How dare she imply that my love was replaceable, that my absence had not left an unbearable void in their tiny hearts? I wanted to scream, to rip that clipboard from her hands and tear it to shreds. But I couldn't. I had to stay calm. I had to play by their rules if I wanted any chance of getting them back. I nodded, forced a thank you past the lump in my throat, and watched as she left my apartment, taking my fate with her. The days after the home visit were the longest of my life. Every ring of my phone sent my heart into a frenzy. I barely slept, haunted by nightmares of my children calling for me, reaching out with tiny hands that I couldn't grasp. Then, finally, the call came. I was denied. Concerns about stability. A need for continued observation. The best interest of the children. I collapsed onto the floor as the words registered, my body racked with silent, heaving sobs. My chest burned. My hands clawed at the carpet as if I could tear a hole into the world and pull them back to me. They were gone. I had done everything right. I had fought. I had begged. I had sacrificed. And it hadn't been enough. The weight of it crushed me, pressing against my ribs until I couldn't breathe. I thought of Rowan's giggle, of Eliana's sleepy murmurs as she curled against me at night. I thought of how they would call for me in the dark, how they would wake up every morning expecting me to be there, only to find that I wasn't. Would they think I abandoned them? Would they believe I didn't fight hard enough? Something inside me snapped. I couldn't let this be the end. If the system had failed me, if my parents had failed me, then I would take matters into my own hands. The law had taken my children from me, but I refused to let it keep them. I grabbed my coat, my hands shaking as I stuffed a backpack with essentials. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I pulled up the address I had memorized from the case files. The foster home wasn't far. 20 miles. A short drive, a lifetime away. I stepped out into the cold night, my breath visible in the air, my entire being electrified with purpose. I would get my children back. One way or another.